Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to have a play with the old SCX10 Honcho. I was running it around on some wet grass to clean up the tyres and I noticed it kept cutting out. I tried a few things, but I ended up trying another model with a compatible receiver and I had the same problem, which just leaves the transmitter as the fault. I popped the case off and there wasn't anything obvious, so rather than mess about we're going to be changing the transmitter to a GT3B with the modified firmware. That also means we're going to need to swap the FlySky receiver. We're just going to use a 3-channel one, nothing fancy. And of course, since this Honcho already has some LEDs fitted, it would be rude not to get them all working with a mini light controller. So we're going to have control over the front spots, the headlights, tail lights and the reverse lights. Which brings me on to the subject of the light controller availability. Well, we've got as far as assembling the surface mount bits on a load of boards. They're just waiting for the pin header and the external wiring to be fitted, but they are very nearly there. Okay, here's the shell, pretty much as Axial intended on the outside with only a couple of minor changes. At the front we've got the headlights already wired up with a lead that runs to the box. We're going to keep all that as it works, and the box will do the job as a junction point for all the wiring. At the back we've got a set of Axial light pods all rigged up as the tail lights and reverse. I was going to keep them, but then I got a new toy in the post, so all the rear lights, the pods and wiring are going to be removed. The new toy, which is just past the junk pile that lives out of shot, is an ANET A6 3D printer. It was 160 quid in kit form from Banggood, although I think the price has gone up now. After spending some time tinkering with it, it is outputting some very nice prints. What we have here is a pair of rear light clusters. I did try to do a time lapse with the run cam, but the battery didn't last as long as the print, and with the bed sliding back and forth it is a little bit nausea inducing, but it almost worked. The end result, which is remarkably difficult to remove from the bed one-handed, is a set of parts ready to bolt to the Honcho's body. The file to make the parts comes from Thingiverse and it's completely free, although there is a tip system so you can give a couple of quid to support the part designer. I'll put a link in the description. All we need to do is clean up a little bit of excess plastic and separate the parts. The printer's fairly well set up, but it's still leaving some thin strings of plastic here and there. Once they're all cleaned up, we can pop some LEDs in. These clusters have slots for 3 5mm LEDs and a single 3mm on the outside. Plenty to be a bit creative with the layout if you want. To get the red box out, all we do is undo the 2 screws that fix the bottom of the cage to the body, being very careful not to lose the plastic washers. Then we can pull the bottom of the cage from the front bit and slide out the box. The box was made from good old balsa wood when I put the kit together. I always thought the Honcho looked a bit off with the top of the fuel cell moulded into the cage's platform, but it didn't have anything underneath. As you can see, there's already a bunch of wires going into the box. The only one we need to keep is the one going off to the headlights. The rest we can just cut away. I'm going to leave the leads to the light pods as long as possible, as they're still perfectly functional, and one day I'm sure they're going to be just right for another project, so they'll get boxed up and stored away. The pods are attached with M2 screws, so we just remove them and the pods come away. This does leave us with a bunch of extra holes in the silver platform. They're not too unsightly, but I think we're going to need to think of something to cover them up. The bottom of the red box has a lid, so we can easily open it up and see what's inside. Looks like we've got some strip board with a load of resistors. Well, we don't need any of that, so we can cut away all the wiring, just remembering to leave the wires that go off to the headlights as long as possible so we can connect up to them later. And there we go. That's enough of the old setup removed that we can start putting together the new. Now, I've gone and soldered up the LEDs already. We've got 3 reds, which I've painted with some Tamiya clear red, and a white on the end for reverse. Connecting them up is simple enough. Here's a little diagram of one of the clusters. It's just a case of giving each LED a resistor. The reds get 1K, so the total current is something manageable for the mini light controller. There's going to be 6 in total on that channel. And the reverse LED gets a 220 ohm, as white LEDs need a bit more power than the other colours, and besides that there's only going to be 2 of them. The connections to the outside end up with only the 3 wires. I've got pink for the 6 volts, yellow for the tail lights and white for the reverse. To fit the mounts we need to remove 4 screws, 2 on each side. The stock screws go in through the top into lugs in the cage. All well and good, but they don't go all the way through the lugs, so they're going to be far too short to mount up the LED mounts. To replace them, I'm going to use some M2x12s. Now these ones are stainless rather than black, but they'll do just fine. The other change I'm going to make is to install the screws through the bottom and use some M2 plain nuts on the top. That way we'll be able to remove the silver plastic bit from the cage without having to remove the lights too. All we need to do is install the mounts and the screws from the bottom, doing up the screws so they're just nice and snug. The idea being they're going to be tight enough to hold the mounts in place and tight enough that we can do up the nuts on the other side without the screws backing out. The 12mm screws are just the right length. 10mm would be too short. We'll need a smear of thread lock on the threads before we fit the nuts. The usual cocktail stick transfer will do the trick. We just need a tiny amount. Do up the nuts and you can feel when they start to stiffen up when they're in contact with the plastic. We just need them tight enough that they'll hold the plastic in place but not crush it. So make contact, then an extra half a turn or so will do just fine. Repeat on the other side and we've got the rear light mounts ready to go. They almost look like they were part of the original kit. Very nice. The only problem I had was the holes didn't quite line up, by less than a millimetre. Now I could have modified the STL file and moved the holes and printed another pair, but they were so close it only took a couple of passes with a file to make them good. Now the mounts are on, we can fit the LEDs. The 5mm reds are all quite a loose fit in the holes, but the 3mm LEDs are a tight fit, so that will keep them in place while we route all the wires. Very roughly we'll want the wires to run up the sides of the spare wheel well, then along the bottom to the box. To be sure nothing's going to get caught, it makes good sense to pop the body onto the chassis and get a feel for where everything's going to sit. I think it's going to be best to run the wire in parallel with the bar in the cage, then along up the wheel well and along the bottom. It's going to protect the wires fairly well. The only other route might be to go all the way around the edge of the wheel well, then down to the bottom, but that's going to get a bit close to the suspension mount and the body posts. But we can always move things around later if we need to. So we start by loosening the screws that hold the bottom of the cage to the rest of the structure, just so we've got a bit of slack to run the wires. Pass them under the cage and then roughly to the right spot. To keep the wires in position, I'm just going to use a couple of spots of hot glue. It's going to stick well enough, but it won't be impossible to peel it off later if we want to change anything. To get the wires into the box, I'm going to open up one of the holes that's already there, drilling it out to 4mm. It's only balsa, so a quick spin between my fingers does the job quite easily. And there we go, that's all the LED connections in the box. That just leaves the connection to the chassis. We only need 4 wires, so I'm using one of these connectors that's usually sold for RGB LED strips, hence the colours. For this install it's going to work a treat as it's a latching connector with nice chunky internal connections. To fit it we're going to need another hole in the box, 5mm this time, so we can stuff the ends of the wires in, like so. Now all we do is solder up the LED wires to the connector and reassemble. Here's a hastily made diagram of all the bits. We've got the 2 sets of 3 wires from the tail lights coming together and the 2 wires from the headlights, and of course they all share the 6V connection. After all the soldering and the heat shrinking, we've got a nice little cluster that looks like this. Not the neatest, but it's going to get sealed up in the box so no one will ever know. Before we do close it up, we should use a bit more hot glue around the 4 wires that go to the connector so it can't tug on the rat's nest of wires. We just need a bit of a blob in there, it doesn't need to be neat. Next the lid goes back on and we can slide it back under the cage bottom. There's a little bit of bending involved as it's quite a tight fit, but in it goes. We need to stuff the excess of the rear light wires into the box too. We should probably seal up the hole as well, just to protect the inside wood from any water. But it'll do for now, a small bit of hot glue would probably do the job. Reinstall the 2 screws that connect the bottom of the cage to the cab, and we're done with the body. Now, I was planning to swap the receiver and install the light controller too, but partway through filming this, bearing in mind I film a little bit here and there during the week, I woke up with the left side of my face swollen up, so I had to book an emergency dentist appointment, which luckily was the same day. They had a poke about, did an x-ray, and found one of my teeth had given up and was a bit manky inside. So they did the first stage of a root canal, boring out the tooth and cleaning out all the dead stuff, and then they gave me a nice box of antibiotics. Could have been worse, but it did mean I lost an entire day of work. So the last thing for this week, we'll be giving the setup a quick test with a power supply. I've connected 6 volts to the red lead. Now if we connect the negative lead to one of the 3 other wires, we should get some lights. The black wire gives us the headlights. I think I'm going to swap the headlight decal for the clear one before you see it next, as it shouldn't block so much of the light. Next we've got the green wire, reverse, and that works a treat. And lastly we've got the blue wire, which is the tail lights. Yep, very nice. And that's about it. I'm going to be painting up the backs of the LEDs with some Tamiya black paint just to block out the excess light, and most likely changing the headlight decals. But other than that, that's the body ready to go. Next week we're going to be on to the G-Made GOM, so the week after we'll swap the electronics around, set up the light controller, wire it up to the spotlights on the bumper, and wire out to the connector to link up with the body. And since that should be fairly quick to do, we might have to do an evening run to test out the lights. That should be fun. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you want to be notified of the next video, and if you want to really make sure you don't miss the next one, click that little bell button too. Leave a comment if you've got something to say, maybe a suggestion of what to put on the back to cover up those holes. Bye guys!